right now. So we are recording this, and we'll make sure I'll send you a link for that, and we'll get you a link for the recording. So if you want to rewatch it, show anybody, then it's there for you. So welcome. We appreciate everybody joining us. I have to disclose, it seems like we're all in different locations. I'm down here in St. George today. Jen's in Provo Orem, and John's in Layton, right?
Yes.
So
Yep.
we're all over, and we want to thank you all for joining us today. We do have another second part of this, which if you saw on the flyer, we're going to do entering into effective conversations that we're doing on the 25th. So we will let you know and get you information on that to have you join us. Please feel free to participate on the chat if you have questions. I didn't ask, Jen, do you want them just piping in, or is it going to be the chat easiest?
You know what? Piping in will be great. Raising their hands. There's a lot of options. So
Okay.
The chat is good.
The chat's always good. I know she's got her chat box open, so we're ready.
I have my
So-
chat box open and I stay aware of it. And so I try to answer those questions as well. And there'll be times that we'll ask some questions and you can ask that in the chat as well. We'll try to specify which ones. So
Well, let's get started. And again, at the end, I'll go over what we need to do for the CE for everybody and the new people that just joined. And we'll go from there. Go ahead, Jen.
that sounds good. I'm excited to be with you guys again. So maybe this is your first time to one of the PCBH presentations, or maybe you've been here before and you've had to listen to me before. So I'm glad to see you again. I brought my business partner with me, Dr. John Robbins, and we're excited to be with you guys. So this one is Self of the Therapist, and it's self-reflection and understanding of suicide and grief. And so we're going to ask you guys to participate throughout. And like Michael said, use the chat, raise your hand on the little screens. And yeah, so inclined, pipe on in. And if anybody wants to get their cameras on, that would be awesome. We'd love to see your faces. So and I'm moving to the next slide and making sure that works right there. So I'll let you do this one, John.
Sure. And welcome, y'all. I don't know if y'all, if anyone's been to something Jennifer and I have done, but one of the things that we really ask participants to do is be self-reflective. And it's kind of a theme throughout any presentation we do is, what do you bring into a session? What do you bring into a counseling room? And so because of that, we kind of offer our own ideas about what we've reflected on. And one of our disclaimers is to say that, our reflections are ours and we don't necessarily think they have to be yours. But one thing we would want you to do is, if we say something during this presentation that doesn't feel right or doesn't sit right, or you absolutely disagree with, what we want you to do is really reflect on what are the things that drive you to not agree with it, and what are the values or the beliefs or whatever that you hold. Because I would rather, instead of us try to change each other's beliefs, that we just try to learn and own them and own how they are going to impact us. And by the way, the same thing goes if we say something and you absolutely love it, which Jennifer will say tons of this, and you'll love her. And we want you to do the exact same thing though, is what are those beliefs that drive you to really, that whatever it was said really fits for you. Because what we think is important about anything we're trained in is that we know ourselves and we know what we're bringing into the room. Which is why we think this topic is really important to think
Yeah.
to do, because part of this started with something that happened with in my life a few years ago, several years ago now, where there were some parents who had a 14-year-old, and they had gotten in a fight. The kid didn't want to go to church, and they were fighting with him to go to church, and basically left it at, whatever. And the kid didn't go. And they went to church, and when they came home, they found him hanging from the ceiling. And about 24 hours later, because it was a friend of mine's friends, about 24 hours later, I was sitting in their house with them, with this couple. And I sat there for about 2 hours with them in just beside themselves. And that doesn't even do justice. But there was this intense emotion, and I didn't say one word for 2 hours, which Jennifer knows is very difficult for me, but I said nothing. And as I thought back on it later and talking with Jennifer, I never read in a textbook, and I never got in my training or in my knowledge anything that would prepare me for something like that. I never read that as a counselor, there was going to be a moment in time where for 2 hours, I wasn't going to say a single word. And I was going to sit with people in their grief. And
Yes.
go ahead.
So as John and I were talking about, this presentation, we started putting things together. We started thinking about who deals with like suicide grief, who's dealing with the families right away, and who's sitting in those rooms with them, and who's dealing with them. And so we thought this would be a good forum to bring it to, because we've got people from school districts here, we've got people from hospitals, we've got outpatient therapists, and I'm sure I'm missing, a population, maybe residential treatments. So we have people who are going to be sitting in this crisis with clients in their most crisis state and their deepest grief and their deepest sorrow. And I know that when I started out as a therapist, one of my biggest fears was suicide. And I don't know about the rest of you. Anybody else worry about suicide and clients? So I have Faye nodding her head, and hopefully they're the right names on here. So if I call you something else, sorry, Faye. Good job, thanks. But hands up, does anyone in here worry about their clients and suicidal ideation? Shelly's got a hand up. Anybody in the comments? Like, just this, to me, it's one of the scariest things that we have as therapists, is having this situation happen to us. So it really impacts how we approach the grief of suicide as well, because we're so scared that it happens. I mean, when I'm dealing with people I have several clients right now who've had a family member die by suicide. And they often say that people say things to them like, well, did you see the signs? Did you see anything? And they feel so blamed for it. That's what my client last week said to me was, I just feel like they're saying to me, you didn't see it and you should have seen something. But a lot of times as therapists, we're asking those questions too because of our own fears. Like, well, did you see something coming up? Because we want to be assured that we can see something, that there's some control. And Tiff here said, Tiff Y, it looks like, it's harder when it happens in your own family as well as clients. And that is so true. Because this really is just one of the scariest things. So we have to be really clear on how we feel about this topic. A lot of times we're like, I don't know even how to speak about it. I was talking to somebody that's not a therapist that's in HR, and he said, we prescribe, and he's like, I've been told otherwise, but I still sometimes feel like, well, if I bring up suicide, that is going to make the risk go up. There's still these beliefs out there that if we talk about it, it's going to be something, it's going to put that idea in their head.
Yeah, and one of the things at the very end of this PowerPoint, we actually have a list of the models of grief, and I don't think we have it in there, but we could put in even different suicide assessment tools. And I think all of us are trained in those things, and we get introduced to those things. And one of the things Jennifer and I believe is that that's jumping ahead. Before, and in fact, I think the models and the assessments protect us from us experiencing, what does this mean to us? How is this going to impact us? And so when we say suicide, what do you think when you hear the word suicide? What does that mean to you? And what's your role when suicide is introduced into the room?
I think
the words
jump on in, keep going. Somebody was commenting. I don't know, we lost them.
I think they just weren't on mute.
But we do have a couple comments in here that Terry also says, unfortunately, there are beliefs being promoted in Utah that suicide is 100% preventable. And she says, I'm totally in disagreement with this.
Yeah. And one of the things Jenny had mentioned, I saw, and we asked sort of toward the end is, what does it feel like for you that you may not be able to control this? That you may not be able to do anything about it? And you may or may not believe that, and that's fine. But if you don't believe that, or if you do believe that, then how does that influence you when there are all these social pressures to control it?
Am I the only one, and maybe I feel guilty for saying this, but when it's not in my control, it honestly takes a relief off my shoulders. Like, I know as a therapist, and it's been a concept I've had a hard time accepting, but I can't control what my clients choose to do. I can give them tools, I can give them support, I could give them interventions, but ultimately I cannot take away their choice. And my own brother attempted suicide 3 times and finally was successful. And while I grieve that, ultimately I never felt guilty, even though I saw the signs and we did all we could to help him. I mean, ultimately it was his choice. So I feel a sense of relief that I'm not 100% in control of that, because that's a heavy responsibility.
It really is. And I think when we feel like we're in total control, and I really thank you, Tiffany, for sharing that.
Yeah.
And somebody else in the chat's agreeing with you that they feel the same way. But that's the thing. When we feel like we are in control and that we should have done something, and it is, our fault if somebody dies by suicide, then we don't do as good of a job with them in the room. And Somebody else, John, is talking about the liability piece.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
we need to think about what is the social influence on us regarding suicide. What responsibilities do people place on therapists? Even Tiffany, I love what you had to say, and yet there are some processes in place that may go against you or disagree with you. And so to think about what are those social pressures that we have on us? And then what does that do when you think about them? When you think about liability, when you think about when somebody says they're suicidal, the immediate reaction of their friends is you need to see a counselor, which is this implied, then it's our responsibility. What does it say that we have to have 2 hours of suicide training required when we don't have to have 2 hours of domestic violence or 2 hours of depression or 2 hours of anything else but suicide and ethics? But 2 hours of suicide, we are required by the state to keep your license. And what does that say? And what is the influence that we have to fix it?
That's my concern. I'm the one that made that comment about the liability because we are required to do this assessment, write a safety plan, where I feel sometimes that that's not the right time to do that. But at the same time, we're liable if something terrible happens like that. And so that's my concern because it feels very impersonal when I am like, well, let's pull out the safety plan when sometimes they've seen it before. I mean, I had a conversation with a client last night where she's like, I have a safety plan. It doesn't work.
Right.
It's not helpful. And so we talked about it. You know, we didn't write it down and put it on the refrigerator. But I think that's that's like the conflict I deal with, is because we're required to do the assessment. We're required to write the safety plan. We're required to give them the number for the crisis hotline. But then are we really helping the client? Or are we just doing what we're supposed to be doing?
Right. And we've got Stanislav, you said we need to be ready to do our part in assessing and hopefully preventing suicide. Correct. And we need to sit with our clients in their pain. So it's figuring out how to do both of those things. And Joyce, yeah, sometimes the process is the problem. Sometimes we rely too much on the assessments that we don't sit and validate the pain that they're feeling and work through the pain. Instead, we get out the assessment and we hide behind that assessment. And so that's really what we're talking about. It's how do we sit with people in these deep emotions? And because these aren't but things, this is an and follow through on the process and do it in a way that allows us to sit with them.
And I think to Sarah's point, what I think you're going to hear from us here in a few minutes is that we can assess in a different way.
Yeah.
And that if I can get out of my own way of my own anxiety rising, and I start going, is there a plan? Do you have a means? Do you, and do this boom, 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 where it's a total disconnect to the client. If I can get out of the way of that and manage my own stuff, knowing that there's these things that I have to do, how can I do an assessment that is connecting? How can I ask questions that connect with people? And that we talk about, it's kind of a pet peeve of mine, but we talk about meeting people where they are. And yet when they say they're suicidal, we don't meet them where they are. We go directly to our list of things and become kind of this, maybe not robotic, but we're doing this checklist of things. And how do we do something different? And how do we ask different questions that can still give us the information that we need? It's kind of jumping ahead
make a
there.
comment. I work in the emergency department, and it's extremely stressful because, everywhere you go, it says, if you're in danger, go to the emergency department. Right? Like, we're supposed to be the ones who can do emotional CPR, and we're supposed to be the ones who can save you. And that we're supposed to have all these resources and can whisk you away into a psych unit where you can be safe, and that somehow we're going to have something valuable to offer. And I feel like it's very overpromised and under-delivered, because there's not a whole lot you can do besides sit with them and try to help them, the same way you would in outpatient therapy. But it is tricky when you do have to take away somebody's rights, as far as putting them on an involuntary hold. And especially when they don't have insurance, and one of the reasons for being suicidal is money. And suddenly you're like, oh, you're not gonna be able to go to work tomorrow because you're gonna be here and you're gonna have a huge bill. So it's like to keep you alive for the next 3 days. And then you may or may not follow through anyway when you get out. So I don't know, it's extremely, extremely hard. But one of the things that I really try to do with my clients is, try to help them explore why suicide is their best option, and try to see why is that, why is that on sale this week? Like, why is that the best option right now for you? Instead of, well, you can't kill yourself. Like, okay, well, let's look at other, because, ultimately they can if they really want to. And if you get in the way, you get in a power struggle with them, and then you're not going to try to be where they're at. But it's really stressful.
Yeah, and Carolyn, I think that's exactly why we do these trainings. Is you just showed an awareness of the system that you're in, and the pressures and what you're being asked to do from society, and from probably even the system within, and how you then how you manage those pressures when you're sitting in front of someone. Let me go back real quick to Terry and the grief, and sitting there for 2 hours. My social side is, and I think we've all seen this, where people say things to people in grief that aren't helpful at all. They're in a better place now, and those kinds of things. And I'm saying those things to people to make myself feel better, because my anxiety's through the roof. If I'm not paying attention, my anxiety will go through the roof. With a friend of mine whose kid had died or something. And so I just am saying stuff to lower my anxiety. And so I had to pay attention to that with this couple, because trust me, I wanted to say a million things. Because I was like, oh my God, how do I take this away from them?
How do I fix this?
How do I fix it? How do I make it better? How do I make it go away? And the same thing for me early on. It's not as much anymore, but early on, when suicide came up, those same things happened for me. How do I fix this? How do I make it better? How do I make it go away? How do I stop it? And those things put pressure on me to do stuff that weren't connecting to what was happening with the client in front of me. It was my agenda. It wasn't theirs any longer.
Yep.
So Jennifer, I think the next.
I'm going to move to the next slide, but my mouse just went crazy. So sorry, I'm having a little bit of a moment. There we go. So we look at for ourselves to kind of get a gauge on where we are in this process. It's asking ourselves these questions. What do we believe?
Mhm.
You know, really sitting with somebody who's dealing with suicide grief, with a family member or a friend, somebody who has died by suicide, we're asking all these questions. Where do they go? Is there life after death?
Mhm.
Can I communicate with them? Will I be reunited with them? And these happen just in your basic grief situations. But then we think about with suicide, well, is suicide a sin? So maybe I won't ever be reunited. Maybe they're sitting locked behind, they're in some purgatory place and they're being punished for their behaviors. I mean, there's a lot of those things that people who have family members who've died by suicide hear about where their loved one is. And so we have to ask ourselves those questions because we're sitting with these individuals.
And I think if you go to the next slide, I think
Yep.
another part is that the individuals have to hear from social, their friends, and what does it mean to tell your friends my wife died by suicide, as opposed to my wife died by cancer?
Cancer.
And the judgments and the concerns and the messages that are given to someone that has had a family member that has died by suicide.
Yeah, Shauna, you made a comment in there and it says, my best friend died and I was told by religious leaders around me that it was a sin and I will never see him again because he went to hell. Like, those are the messages that we hear surrounding suicide. And we really have to ask ourselves, are we believing those things? And I've done deep dives into some religious doctrine around suicide and found things that actually counteract this "it was a sin" kind of concept as well from people from religious leaders. So there's these, double messages sometimes that we receive, and this idea that they're going to hell and it's all over for them. It impacts how they deal with their grief. And also you look at that and so if my best friend's in hell and I'll never see them again, or my spouse is, I'll never see him, why would I want to live here any longer? What's my purpose? And so then we find out that the people around those who are impacted by suicide, they're at high risk for suicide as well. So now you've got somebody who's grieving who also is at high risk for suicide, statistically.
And Jennifer, I think going back to your existential question, just to hit on, and you don't have to go back, but
Okay.
hit on the idea of how do we answer these questions for ourselves?
Yes.
Because after Terry, somehow people learned that I did this with this couple. And so I've been in the Layton Ogden area. If a child unexpectedly dies, I'm somehow getting called in. And I've had parents that are really struggling with their kid is just going to hell. And because that's the belief system that they're in. And the real struggle about what do I do? And what do I, and then it becomes this idea of a battle between loving their kid and the religion and believing who wants to believe that their kid's going to hell?
Right.
Yeah.
And there's some comments about this, we can't judge them because we don't know what's going on. And yes, somebody above that said, let's hope that these people in these helping positions, we don't push our beliefs, no matter what they are, and the people we're talking to. The only way we can do that, that's kind of our assertion here is that the best way we can do that and make sure we're not pushing those things is that we're aware of what they are.
Yeah.
That's why we're saying be self-reflective and think about what you do believe and what you think, because sometimes those things inadvertently come out as a well-meaning comment. And that's why we have to be so aware. That's this whole idea of self-reflection. So I totally agree with you.
Yeah, I'll go as far as this, and some of y'all, this is kind of being just
This is when John makes some controversial statement.
This is being a little provocative, but when we try to stop somebody from committing, from trying to commit suicide, when we try to stop someone, we are pushing our values on them. I mean, it's recognizing your beliefs, and that it's intentionally or purposefully using them in the room. Because I think we do push our values on people, and we do bring our values into the room. And so it's a matter of when do I pay attention to my values and leave them, sitting next to me, and when do they start controlling or directing what I am doing in session?
Yeah, and that's not to say that we don't think, I mean, it's very important to try to prevent suicide, but we also need to understand that we can't control all of that.
Right.
So it's a really hard thing for a lot of us as we sit with these people. And I will say there's been a couple of statements of committed, and it's just my thing is, and what our suicide task force in Utah have asked us to do is to make sure that we're using proper terminology, because committed in and of itself implies committed a crime or a sin. And the reason that committed suicide is one of those statements that comes up so easily, comes out of our mouth so clearly, is because we have been socialized to say those two words together versus died by suicide or, completed suicide or something like that. It takes some of the judgment out of it as well. So it's just one of those.
Because we don't commit cancer.
Yeah, we don't commit cancer. So
I think that it's an important distinction to understand the social position of that we have taken for a long time regarding suicide.
yep.
And how that when we get in those bubbles, we're not paying attention to the idea of when we want to prevent someone from committing or from attempting suicide, when we want to prevent someone, which I believe is part of our role, we are making a judgment. We are taking a value and we're imposing it. And I think that that's something that is part of our role. And I think that that's something, but to understand that and to know that that is a value. I'd go as far to say, outside of suicide, when we are trying to get someone to change, that's our value. Just change, people changing. It's a value that we're imposing, where, there's actually therapists and models of therapy that basically say, we don't think people should change.
So I'm going to move us to this next slide, because this is about really, it is our role. Part of our role is to help people to move past the pain that they're feeling. And it's also, we're sitting with people that have experienced some family member or friend who has died by suicide. And so those are our roles. So, so one of the things that John and I, when we've talked about this topic, I was dealing with somebody who was really chronically suicidal. And family systems wise, like this was just their chronic suicidal ideation. And I didn't know what else to do with them. And so I started looking for alternative kind of assessment tools for them. And just like Carolee, you said, why is suicide on like the best, it's on sale today? Because we really have to understand that. And so we've put together these questions of who do you need to say goodbye to? So if your plan is to die, who do you need to say goodbye to? Who'll be happy when you're dead? Who's going to be the most sad about it? Who do you want to find you? And what do you think you're going to look like when you're dead? When you start to look at those things, these are assessment tools and questions that also generate a lot of material about the pain, a lot of things that you can talk about and talk through the pain that they're feeling.
So one of the things to think about is when Jennifer says these are assessment tools, they're also prevention. Because what we know about suicide is that people disconnect from people. They become disconnected. So if you're asking who do you need to say goodbye to, you're asking them to connect to someone. You're asking them to think about someone other than self. And so if they say, I don't know, that's an assessment. They're disconnected. But if they have 3 or 4 people, it's also a matter of, you can then ask about those people. Well, what would you say to them? What would they say back? And now they're having conversations with people in your office that aren't there, but they're reconnecting to the world. And that becomes an assessment and a prevention tool. You know, I've asked, who do you think should speak at your funeral? And what do you want them to say about you? And it's not just to be ugly and mean. It's if we truly want to meet clients where they're at, they are suicidal. So let's talk about their experience. But let's broaden it to places that we can begin to understand. Are they disconnected? Do they have plans? And all of the things that we learn from the checklist, we can ask in ways that are connecting to a person. The person doesn't have to fight you about being suicidal. You just allow you allow suicide to be in the room. I've always said, if somebody tells you in the first 5 minutes they're suicidal, you got 50 minutes with them. You don't have to go into, oh God, we got to get them to the hospital right away. You got time. And so can you have a conversation, or does suicide take up so much space in your emotion and in your ideas of what I should do, that you're not able to sit and be interested in them and what got them there and what it's like to even be there.
So, I mean, the real suggestion here is look at the tools that you have, those assessment tools, and add to it and get comfortable with having those difficult conversations about this topic that we are all uncomfortable around because of, as Sarah said, liability. Like, it makes us so nervous that somebody is going to do this, and then it's going to be our fault. And then how can we emotionally handle it? And we get into that place in our head and it starts spinning, and we don't think to ask these kinds of questions. And the person, when I asked this chronically suicidal person, I said, what are you going to look like when you're dead? And she said, I will look beautiful like an angel, and everyone will admire my beauty. And I said, well, that's so really what you want is you want everybody to see how beautiful you are. And let's talk through that. And then let's talk through how will you really look? Are you going to accomplish that with this death and with people finding you? And how can you do this in a different manner? And so it's looking at it and really trying to understand where they're sitting at that moment. So Jenny, yeah, I would encourage you, try those questions out. They're really uncomfortable initially, but then it's amazing the information you get from them.
And I think it is way more connecting to where they are in their emotional state. And once you are asking those questions, you'll get a sense of how disconnected, how connected they are, how ambivalent they are to this, you know, and how much they can think in the future. Because asking who do you want to speak at your funeral and even having them start planning is a future thought. And if they can't do that, that's an assessment. You know, and so it's a matter of we're trained to be curious about suicide, but we're trained to be curious about about these kind of robotic things. And instead of trained to be, can you be curious about the emotion of suicide?
Yeah. As well as for liability, do these other items.
But
It's not an either or.
I think that's what I think the liability and the assessments protect us from having to experience the emotion of suicide in the room. Because I can stay very clinical with you and get the checklist done and an understanding, a cognitive understanding of where you are suicidally, but have I connected with you in the emotion of the room? And how much does that, and ask yourself, how much does that scare me to be in that much emotion in a room? And be okay with it.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah.
No.
In my former life as an outpatient therapist, I had a number of clients who completed suicides. And at the time, of course, it was, you know, it was overwhelming and sad, but particularly in two cases, this is kind of circling back to, I believe, Tiffany. I did everything. I engaged them in outpatient therapy. In one case, I had law enforcement remove guns from the house. I had them put on antidepressants. I hospitalized them in Provo. Well, actually, I arranged for a hospitalization. I had family involved. I had this person medically cleared in our ER. He wanted to go home and pack his clothes, and he blew his brains out. You know, and ironically, I later had a young police officer as a client who was quite depressed. And this officer somehow felt that they were responsible for that suicide. So I was actually able to say, wait, you weren't. This was my client. But I had another client who was from out of state, sent up to UVRMC, did all the good work. Family flew in from out of state, took them to their home, set them up in counseling, ended up suiciding. I think if our heart is in it and we're present and we document and we connect, then ultimately we can't be in someone else's mind. We can only respond to what they're telling us. And somehow we have to learn to let it go.
Right. Yeah. And I think those are great. That's really what we have to look at. It's like, yeah, we have to do all these things, but we also have to know that ultimately each individual has their own free choice, you know, on the decision they're going to make. And so we have that time with them. But it's this interesting idea that we all as society tend to feel like it is our responsibility which in some ways is really great and in some ways is not. And so then this slide that I just put up, this counselor as survivor, as you're talking, Terry, this was the next slide. Often that same feeling of hopelessness that the client has felt becomes, what our survivors feel. So then we feel ultimately responsible and we start to get in that hopelessness. So it's this whole idea, and the reason we're talking about this is so we can start to look at ourselves. Like self of the therapist is so important as we're doing our own work and we're looking at our own emotions and what we bring in. And we definitely were told, when you walk through the door, no emotion, you're supposed to be a blank slate. Well, that doesn't happen. We are wired for connection with people. And we want to save them. We want to fix them. We want to help them get better. That's why, I don't know a lot of therapists who went into the field because they really hate people and they really don't care about anybody else. So we have to look at what we're bringing in and how we approach this topic.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, John. I'm just going to move to the next slide.
Yeah, one of the interesting things is that, we're taught one of our basic counseling skills is empathy. And empathy is being in the other person's shoes or experiencing what the other person's experiencing. And what you've probably already know is that our clients invite us into their world, and they invite us to experience what they're experiencing. And so when we're talking about grief or when we're talking about suicide, there are invitations to feel that grief. There's invitations to feel hopeless that our clients are offering us. And so one of the important pieces to know is that you are always being invited into that, and how to not accept that invitation of feeling hopeless. And one of the important pieces that Jennifer and I talk about is the common factors in helping people. And it's long story. This is a huge study, a meta-analysis that looked at all kinds of different models, all kinds of different presenting problems, all kinds of different residential, outpatient hospitals, all kinds of different contexts. And they looked for what are the common factors that created change in counseling. And they found these 4 and they weighted them. And so one of the things, I won't go through all of it because y'all can see it, but extra therapeutic factors are really what the client brings into the room. And that's the biggest piece that creates change. And so 40% of what they found change happening, we don't have anything to do with. Which may be humbling. It may be, I don't know what it may be for people, but they found this. And by the way, this has been repeated, and they did this with thousands of studies. But one of the ones that I think we try to highlight when we're talking about grief and suicide is this hope and expectancy. If we're being invited into losing hope, then how do you maintain hope? How do you hold on for yourself and be relentless about knowing that things can be better? And not accepting the invitations, and basically, how do you hold on to hope in the face of devastation? And that becomes a really critical piece as a clinician to think about for yourself. And that's why at the very beginning, when we talk about, we think it's jumping ahead to learn all these different models and stuff. It's how do I hold on to hope when I am sitting in a room that is devastated and inviting me into being that.
So, and I know, John, we have just a few minutes left.
Of course, because we have a million more things to say.
I know. But I'm going to, I mean, let me run through this next slide. It's becoming, comfortable with uncertainty. Recognizing how you can, I think this is the big question. It's what gets in the way of you getting and developing a genuine relationship with your client. And so, like Sarah, your example of last night and sitting with the client and talking through while also doing the assessment and, trying to figure out how to do all that. I think it's sitting for yourself and looking, what is getting in the way? What about my beliefs or my fears or my own personal losses that gets in the way? And how do I then learn how to use those things in the room to help versus to get in the way? And John stated earlier, like, how do we get out of our own way?
And what is my role? And first and foremost, I think our role is to create connection. We can always be, social control agents. If the person's in the room and I think they're suicidal, I know that I'm not going to let them leave the room.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean I have to go into social control right away. It's how can I create connection and be human and allow the emotion to be in the room? With the whole time knowing that at any point I can say, would you like to call someone to take you to the hospital, or would we want to call the police, or how we want to do this? I can always.
Because Carol Lee's waiting.
Yes, because Carol Lee is sitting there waiting with the list of questions.
But yeah, at that point, I mean, that's what our acute hospitals are for, is to, help us have those times to take the control away and to step in. But yeah, go ahead, John.
One other thing Harry Aponte talks about, and he is the self of the therapist kind of guru. He talks about, what are your signature themes that drive you as a counselor, and we won't go through them much, but he talks about, do you have a need to save people? And if you have this need to save people, then that's going to drive what you do as a therapist. Do you have to be important in the process? Do you feel like you have to bring yourself into the process? Do you feel as though your role, are you being intentional? Or are you just doing something that feels familiar and comfortable?
Oh yeah, this is intentional self-reflection. And I've just put up this slide, and people are asking in the chat. Michael will send out a PDF of this, so it's smaller and doesn't explode your email. And there's a lot of information in here that we try to get through, but this is such an important topic, it's hard to do so. But there's this slide too on what clients say get in the way. Clients know when we're getting anxious, and when they bring up suicide and our anxiety goes up and we pull out our papers, they sense that and they're reporting that.
And I think when we go into this kind of rote kind of suicide assessment, it communicates our own anxiety.
Yeah.
It communicates, oh, now my liability meter has kicked in, and I'm doing all these things to save my behind or cover my behind, and I'm going to create a safety plan, and I'm going to do these things, and it can communicate anxiety.
And so we're not suggesting not to do those things, but to pair them, with these other discussions where you are connecting with them and encouraging that connection. The majority of the time when somebody wants to die, it's because they want to get out of their pain that they're feeling. And so we want to sit and understand their pain, understand their emotions. So there's some signature themes in here. And let's look at what we can bear, where our job is to bear witness with our clients. I like this idea of you're bearing witness because you're standing with the person and you're sitting with them in their pain. And it allows them permission, to face the pain that they're feeling, and knowing that another person can also sit with them in that. It allows them to look at it, because a lot of times we just feel like if we feel our emotions, it's going to take over. It's out of control and it's all going to hit the fan, and we're not going to be able to know what to do with all of that emotion. And so we just keep shoving it down. And so as therapists, as school counselors, as people, crisis workers, we're sitting with people all the time in their worst moments. And so it's helping us, like for us, we've got to sit, what can we bear? What can we sit with them at? And how can we get really comfortable with those really uncertain moments, those really uncomfortable conversations? So.
And again, it goes back, we have a lot of information toward the end. What our hope is in doing this presentation is that it begins to get you into a self-reflective habit where you can take this information and pay attention to, can I be in a sacred and emotionally rich space with people? Instead of thinking of emotion as good or bad, and the bad we try to get rid of, can I lean in and be interested and curious about all of it?
Yeah. I know we're over, and Michael needs to give you some information so that you can get your CEUs. There's a question in the chat that I'm going to do my best to answer for you, Vicki, in a very quick response. But Michael, I'll turn it over to you to give them their instructions, because I know this is a lot of people's their lunch hour. So. You're muted, Michael.
The number one phrase said in 2020.
Let me get this to the right screen where.
Oh, and I lost my chat box. I'm sorry, Vicki.
Vicki asked, just wondering, how do you help someone to get help or counseling? Any suggestions?
And my answer was going to be sit with them and ask them why they don't want to get counseling or why they don't want to get help, and what do they believe is the way that you do get help or don't get help.
Is that showing?
No, your email is showing, Michael.
Now is it showing?
Nope.
It's not.
Oh,
There you go.
there you are.
Okay.
Grief.
Oh.
111.
Okay. So if you're looking for CE credit, I will send you an evaluation. Actually, I've got it. I'm going to post the link here in the chat box. You can see I'm copying it. There's the link for the evaluation form, and you will be asked a code word. There's your code word. If you have any questions, you can email me. But the only other thing I can think of is, yeah, we'll be back in 2 weeks on the 25th. So we'd look forward to you joining us. I'll send a copy of Jennifer and Dr. John's slides and a link to the recording. And thanks for joining us. Yeah, I wish we could go longer. This has been a great topic. I just had Mikkel, do you see the code word? Oh, there, good. Someone typed it in.
That was me.
Okay,
It looks like
wonderful.
somebody's saying they can't access the link though, Michael.
If you cannot access the link, because I do know we have some hospitals that have firewalls, some government agencies. If you will email me, I will send you that link. And that way you can tell me what email to send it to, and you can open it up at a later time on the message. And I will, in case that got bumped down a little bit, there's the link again. So thank you for joining us. If there's any questions and you'd like to stay on, I think John and Jennifer will answer those real quick. So
Yeah, we will.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you guys for coming and for being active participants
Yeah.
and for the work that you do every day. Somebody said that they do a grief support group for survivors. I love that. And
Yeah.
I'm very appreciative of the things that you guys have shared today and the vulnerability shared.
and I have to say, I do know there's a lot of support groups in different towns and cities. Reach out to us. We've got reps in just about every city that we can kind of connect you to any of those and any resources in there. I know I cover everything from Provo clear down to St. George. So yeah, there are a lot of resources out there.
And Eva, I absolutely agree with you. I mean,
Yeah.
as far as the two topics, we kind of put them into one around suicide, but without a doubt, there's a lot to be said about both.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. This is very helpful.
Thank you.
I especially appreciated your comment about the invitation to feel their hopelessness, because I have worked with individuals earlier in my career that I was starting to feel as hopeless as they were.
Mm-hmm.
And it took me a while to kind of realize what was happening there. And so I appreciate that a lot, that, to recognize that. Also, I think it's so important that we have our own support.
Mhm.
Therapists often work solo, like myself, others that you can talk with. We're really out on a limb sometimes, and it can be kind of lonely. And so having other people, other therapists to talk to is really, really helpful as well. So
Absolutely.
agree.
I think you're right on the money. I think this is an isolating profession.
mhm.
And if we're not intentional about it, we can become really isolated. And
Mhm.
I've never seen anything good come out of isolation,
Yeah,
except for the pandemic. But
yeah.
ethical mistakes are made in isolation oftentimes.
Yeah.
People's problems, when you add isolation to them, become bigger. It's just, so I appreciate the comment, Eva.
Okay. We're also not the best at allowing our own vulnerabilities sometimes.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
anyway, I've got to run, but thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a question.
Yeah.
It seems I'm a school counselor, and it seems that it's much easier to deal with my students than it is my own child in this. And I was just honestly struggling last night on the phone with a child that is has been admitted to inpatient and feeling very hopeless. I cried myself to sleep last night.
Sorry.
So I guess, how do you deal with that? How do you help a child that is feeling like no one can help them? That's her biggest nightmare, is that no one can help me here. And
Well,
the
I
parent-
think
go ahead.
I think that a big part of that is, you know, as a school counselor, you're able to have that objectivity, right? Because they're not your kid. And when it is our own kid, our own situation, you know, it becomes a whole different matter, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that, because we oftentimes feel like, well, I'm the helping professional, so I'm supposed to know what to do in this period of time. And, you know, cognitively, maybe we do, but emotionally, this is one of the scariest things that we go through, is something with our own family members.
Right.
I do think that validation of your child is an important part of it, and understanding it. And a lot of times it's utilizing the support of those therapists that are sitting, you know, in the hospital with your child and trying to hear them, and taking your expert hat off as much as you can, and being
Right.
willing to be vulnerable in that moment. I think that's the hardest thing, but it's also the most effective part. You know what I mean?
Yeah, she just says she just feels so lost, and her therapists are saying, what can I do for you? And she's like, I don't know. You know?
Yeah.
Meanwhile, time is ticking and she's about to go stir crazy, and she's not better after 3 days, or 3 horrible days. And I'm like, wow, we're paying an awful lot of money for you to not be feeling any better yet. Is this really the thing to do? This is what I thought the next step was, you know?
Well, I think it's the next step in the crisis intervention, but then from there, there's several other next steps. And oftentimes I encourage family members too to ask those questions. It's like, you know, what do you imagine everyone will feel like? What will you look like? What do you want to accomplish by not being alive any longer? And trying to really understand where she's coming from, because she is lost. So now let's figure out, how does she figure out how to get found again? How does she find what she needs? Because a lot of times therapists, we ask those questions like, well, how can I help you? Well, we have to do better at asking those questions in a different way, because the person in front of us a lot of times doesn't know. If they
Right.
knew, they would probably have already done it.
Right.
So we have to ask it in a different way. What would life look like if you weren't lost?
Yeah.
And for me, as I think I think it's asking around, finding, because for you, it's not going to be you that saves your child.
Right.
I think you can take some steps to find someone that knows what the hell they're doing, quite honestly.
Right.
And that may be finding out from other parents, or because right now you're not a school counselor, you're a parent.
Right.
And so you to embrace that you're going to be human about this, and it's going to be scary as hell.
Yep.
And so ask other parents, ask whoever you know that has been in this and is out of it, what helped and who helped, and find those people to have in front of your child. And I agree with Jennifer, not to make light of it, my wife's a marriage and family therapist. I'm a marriage and family therapist, and we get in fights and silly fights. And we know what the hell we're doing, and we know what we're fighting about, but we're not therapists at the time. We're spouses, and it's a matter of allowing yourself to be human and be a mom or be a parent and find someone that knows what the hell they're doing to be in front of your kid. Because I think that's, for me, that's what helps parents, is feeling as though they've advocated as much as they could for their kid.
I agree.
Right, I guess now it just feels like we don't have real options as far as being an inpatient, that whoever's the therapist there on call or working that day is the therapist. And feels like we're kind of at their mercy, a lot of people's mercy, to know, when we can take charge and take the next step.
Yeah.
That's
And
hard.
That's hard.
Deanna, about 3 years ago, well, I'd been at the hospital, maybe it was 4 years ago. I'd been at the hospital, and I have a daughter who has attempted twice. And I know what you mean. It's like, how did I not see that when it was going on? And especially, I work for the hospital. And that's just it. In the moment, we didn't recognize the triggers. My wife and I now can see some of those triggers when they happen now, but it's been years since it happened. But it's tough. And there is options, there is help out there. And it's hard to see right now, but there is hope that'll happen out there. And however we can help, just, reach out, let us know. Like John said, find those sources that can help you through that.
And I think when I talk about being relentlessly hopeful, for me, it's not about talking someone else into being hopeful and having hope. It's just that you are in the interaction with people, not allowing yourself, whatever that takes. And for some people it takes, all right, this system's not helping. So once this is done, I'm finding the next person to put in front of my child. But how to be relentless for yourself, and not how to talk someone else into being hopeful, because you can lose hope real quick trying to talk somebody into being hopeful that doesn't have hope. And so it's just a matter of deciding for yourself, this is the hope I'm going to hold on to, that maybe not at the moment, but there are other things that are going to happen for this girl.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah. And Michael, I think your story is that's it. It's a matter of, there was something else that was going to happen. And how can I be, I don't know if this is the right word, but how can I be excited for what's going to happen next? How can I honor what's happening right now and be excited for what's going to happen next?
There's still a number of people on. I don't know if other people have questions.
Did y'all step away and you're still logged on?
I'm not required to stay on. I don't know if people know that, but
I see some faces still of people on, so. But there's, nothing else, but this has been a great, it's a really important topic. And so, someone said just listening and learning.
Yep.
So anyone else?
Other questions, comments, concerns?
So the next one, what date is that?
The 25th.
That?
And it will be, let me just look at a different screen here.
January 25th.
January 25th, we're gonna adolescent themes of engagement, entering into effective conversations.
Oh,
So-
Will you guys be sending out a link for that if we already signed up for this See Each Day, or how do we sign up for that one?
It'll be a different Zoom link. So what I'll do is when I send the certificate, I will probably also have a registration link for that class also. And then we'll also kind of get it out to everybody too. But when I send the certificate, I'll try to remember to get that link also attached to the email, and you can just register for it then too.
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
And Michael, I just made a PDF of this and I'll get it over to you right now.
Okay, perfect.
So you can send that out to everybody.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Hey,
And the Provo administration, thank y'all for setting this up.
yeah, thank you guys.
These have been a blast to do. I've loved getting to see everybody and see everybody come back for next classes and stuff. And I get to sit in and listen to all of it. So that's even better.
Just wait until you learn about how to talk to your adolescent.
Mine are all gone. And I think it's easier as an adolescent than when they're married. I think it's harder. I think it's harder when they're married.
We'll have to do one on that.
On the
Adult
difference
children,
between,
that would be amazing.
Yes.
Mhm. That would be
because
one.
you don't have control over those adult children.
No,
Ah,
you don't.
and
That's
yet
the
they'll
thing.
Still are
invite,
parenting them in a lot of ways.
and yet they'll invite you to that and then chop your legs off. When
Uh-huh.
You're competing with other parents.
yes.
Are they giving better advice than you?
Murray Bowen, the founder basically of family therapy, said you don't marry a person, you marry a family.
Mhm.
And so when you bring two families together, you bring all of the rules, roles, and these two people have to negotiate them. And if they lack boundaries and they let other influences in, it's really interesting to look at his stuff. It's really funny.
Does he also look at it as, I mean, what about if one of the kids has divorced parents?
Oh,
So it's not
absolutely.
even two families, it's three families now.
Yes.
And there's even some issues in the two that, oh, it's,
Yes.
like I said, they're easier when they're little.
Yeah. Says the person who's not in the throes of them being little.
Right.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. This was wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank
Yes,
you,
thanks
Brianne.
yes, and we look forward to this next one, and yep. So cool.
Very
Okay.
good.
Anybody just sitting? Oh, now there we go, a few.
Okay, I'm sending it right now.
With the
Perfect.
PDF. So do I
Yeah.
need anything for PDF wise, or I guess it's just a PowerPoint, huh?
Yeah, it's just the PowerPoint, but it's a PDF because then it's small